Good evening, everybody. Namaste, Vanakkam. We are very glad to have Devdip this evening. Many of us know him since childhood. He has now grown to a very big and handsome boy, and at the same time, he's a professor and being invited into different countries. So today is the first session on different main books of Sri Aurobindo. He's going to speak about, and there will be many other sessions, so please look out in the news and notes and Oronet, and maybe sometimes we'll be putting it on the mass bulletin. I will invite Eric, his very good friend, to introduce Devdip. But before I pass the mic to Eric, I just would request all of you to switch on your mobile before you leave this space. Switch on your mobile before you leave this space. So you know what it means. Thank you.
Thank you, Devasmita. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to introduce Devdip, who is a personal friend, to all of you, and who is also a friend of Auroville, someone who has been very keen on helping and participating in the life of Auroville as much as possible. His association with Auroville, actually, his parents were associated with the inauguration of Auroville on 28th February 1968. I think Kauna represented Assam. And yeah, so there's a long association. I met Devdip 10 years ago when we were working on the centenary, the birth centenary of Ushu, disciple of the mother, who was residing in the Sri Aurobindo ashram. And we celebrated at the Pavilion of Tibetan Culture with an exhibition of his paintings. Devdip today is not going to talk to us about Ushu, he's going to talk to us about Sri Aurobindo's magnum opus, the human cycle, and the ideal of the human unity. Devdip teaches at Knowledge in the ashram, the undergraduate course, on those two books, as well as on Indian culture. I think you brought upon also Indian culture. Yes, so do you need the microphone? You have one? Okay, all right. So welcome, Devdip, and looking forward to hearing you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy that I'm honored, honestly, to be invited to speak here in Auroville in front of all of you. I recognize so many of my friends and my teachers who taught me at the ashram school and college. There is Astardi right here. I see some of my former students as well. So it's really wonderful to be here. It's been a year of mostly online classes and conferences and webinars, and it's almost strange to see so many people in front like this. It's wonderful. It's really, I'm privileged, really. So what we'll do is, in the short time that we have, I'll speak for about 40 or 45 minutes and cover some important ideas from Sri Aurobindo's main works on social and political philosophy. But I had initially planned this to be more interactive, but I was not expecting this size of audience. But I will still, as much as possible, occasionally throw some questions at you, like I do to my students. And feel free to, I won't pick on anyone, but feel free to participate if you feel like. And and then we'll also have time for questions and answers. So one thing which is very unique to Sri Aurobindo among the spiritual, as a spiritual master, when we see the long line of spiritual traditions that have existed in India, to focus on the social and political aspect and to see it not merely as in the light of political philosophy, but as a continuation and expansion of his spiritual approach is very unique. We have had in the past traditions which speak about communes or communities, but usually they are focused on creating groups where people can come together in order to pursue a certain line of spiritual practice. So, for example, you might have heard of Buddhist viharas. The Indian state of Bihar is named after the viharas that once were numerous in that region, where groups of monks would come together in order to practice a spiritual life. But here this is different, because it is not simply groups of people coming together for a particular spiritual practice, but a vision of a transformation of society itself. And so a transformation of society as a whole, humanity as a whole, is put forth in the books that we will speak about today. And this is unique among the spiritual traditions of the world, and Sri Aurobindo is truly a pioneer in this respect. Of course, when we speak about Sri Aurobindo's social and political writings, let me give you a brief overview of where you can find these. So, for example, you would all know that in the early period he was involved in the independence movement. And so he wrote extensively in a magazine which he edited, a journal which he edited called Bande Mataram. And those are published today, and you can read many of his writings based on nationalism, where he was putting forth this theory of nationalism in the early period, the early 20th century. Then you have his writings on Indian culture, which are not exactly social and political philosophy, but there is a section in his essays on Indian culture which deal directly with Indian polity as it was once practiced and as it existed in ancient India. And so those chapters are also very interesting. But in fact, it is these books that you see on the screen. I have 3 titles, especially the first 2 titles, which go in depth and present his view and how the integral yoga perspective pans out in a social and political sense. So these 2 books are The Human Cycle and The Ideal of Human Unity. Interestingly, they were written in a period when the world was undergoing tremendous change and crisis. So 1915 is when he starts writing The Human Cycle and finishes writing it in 1918. And it comes out monthly, 1 chapter every month, in the journal Arya, which actually carries most of his major writings. So similarly, The Ideal of Human Unity, he starts writing in 1916 and ends in 1918. And just as the First World War is ending, we have here a vision of a future possibility. And I think that synchronicity is very symbolic, and it's very interesting to note. What is also interesting to note is how many of the ideas and perspectives that he shares in these 2 books pans out through the 20th century right up to the present moment. And so for those of us who are interested in making sense of the world from a Sri Aurobindonian perspective, they offer us some clues which help us to navigate what's happening. Because it's very often, I often get this, there is a sense of, sometimes of even pessimism or concern about where the world is going or how it's shaping up. Is Sri Aurobindo's vision manifesting, or is it going in another direction? But a careful perusal of these works in fact show us that notwithstanding whatever the apparent reality is, there is a certain direction or vision that seems to be manifesting. So we'll try and cover all this. It's a lot to cover in a single session. I usually teach these texts over 3 years. So we'll cover as much as we can, just touch upon some points which I hope will make you, which will encourage you to read the texts yourselves, because that is truly the most important thing, not listening to others, but delving and diving into them yourselves. So one thing which we must recognize is that his social and political philosophy is tied to his evolutionary perspective. So Sri Aurobindo, as you know, the notion of evolution, both biological, of course, comes into the picture, but a spiritual evolution of humanity and the world is central to his teaching. And in his social and political philosophy, this idea of an evolution comes into once again. However, it's an evolution which is focused on human groups and the growth of human aggregates. So there is something which when I was teaching until a few years back, I was teaching also at the high school level and to younger kids. And I used to tell them something when we used to study history. I would say, look, there are two ways in which you can understand history. To explain this in a simpler way, there is history with the small h and there is history with the big H. So the small h history is the facts and the circumstances, the events, who ruled when, what happened, what were the déroulement of events that took place. The history with the big H is the causes, the underlying causes behind those events. Now, this is of course not a new theory. There, even in the study of history, we recognize the various layers of causes. But with Sri Aurobindo, it goes to a certain, you can say, depth, because he is trying to consider the fundamental cause of this whole movement, this whole adventure of consciousness that we are on. And that fundamental cause is basically moving humanity forward towards its spiritual destiny. So that is the perspective with which he looks back at the past and also interprets the present moving to the future. Now, let's start with the ideal of human unity. The name itself is suggestive, so you know straight away what the book is about. Being in Auroville, it's of course very special. It's an ideal which is close to our hearts sitting here today. And the push towards unity, towards human unity, is something that could be seen even by Sri Aurobindo when he was writing this 100 years back. Ironically, during the First World War, he was still saying it's very evident that the world is moving towards movements that will encourage the world to come together in various forms. But there is a paradox with which the book starts, and I want to intrigue you a little bit at the beginning, because that's what Sri Aurobindo does in the book. The paradox is that when you look back in time, you find that some of the most productive and interesting, some of the most creative periods of human history are those in which people have actually lived in small groupings. So whether you look at ancient Greece, classical Greece, right? The city-states of classical Greece separated into small compact units, often competing and even fighting with each other, except for a few occasions in its history when they faced a common enemy. They were mostly strongly competitive. But that period gives some of the most interesting contributions to European civilization, and from there, of course, to the rest of the world. When you look at ancient India, classical India, you find again that one of the most fruitful periods of Indian history is what we refer to as the Mahajanapada period, which is roughly dated to 800 to 600 BCE, and that is a period when India is actually broken into lots of separate republics, traditionally 16 or 17, but possibly more, and especially recent archaeological digs in the south now expand that picture. So what you have is an India which is separated into lots of separate groupings and a lot of interesting things happening there. Again, not peace on superficial peace, but creatively, philosophically, in terms of the schools of thought that were being discovered, and it was a fascinating time of Indian history. And conversely, when you find the world being grouped into large empires, it gives you a sense of, I won't tell you what it gives you a sense of, that's the question for you. But what happens with large empires is that this creative pursuit or expansion is somewhat restricted, though there is a certain assimilation of the previous period. But there is a fundamental problem with small groupings which are divided and broken into different parts. Can you, so now I throw a question at you. Can you tell me what is a problem with a political system which is divided into different groupings? Yes, please.
Nobody is ready to agree with anybody else.
Right, right. So there is disagreement, right? And that leads to instability. It can lead to war. And you will notice that these periods of creative expansion in history don't tend to last very long. So the classical period of Greece, which was a very special period where so much was given to human progress, is at its epoch, at its height, is about 200 years, even less in fact. If you take the reign of Pericles as a kind of symbol of the, the height of Greek thought and culture, it's barely 70 years. Similarly, in India, when you look at the Mahajanapada period, though it lasts, we say 300 to 400 years, but the really crucial periods are again quite short. In contrast, if we take the Roman Empire lasted, was enormous, it was vast, and it continues to expand for some 200, 250 years, and then holds itself more or less for about 400 years before it then starts to slowly collapse. But you have a long period of sustained peace, organization, administration. But you lose out on that spontaneity and that organic growth which characterizes small communities. Now, this abstract notion can be made very real to us on a very day-to-day basis. Take, for example, something that you have organized with a small group of people and compare the task or the experience of that whatever you were doing with organizing something on a much bigger scale. So with my students, I always tell them, they do small programs in the school when they finish school, when they finish college, and I say, compare that experience of just 25 of you organizing a program versus being part of a program where, say, 1,000 people are involved. We have those also in the ashram. So it is very different because the space for the individual is significantly reduced. And that has its inherent disadvantages and advantages. And we talked about that already. The advantages are, of course, that it's easier to centralize, to organize, to administer, but also the disadvantage that it does not lead to as much creativity. So we start the text with a fundamental paradox. If we are moving towards human unity, if that is the goal, is it a goal worth striving for if in the end we end up in a system which assures us prosperity and stability and a certain well-being materially, but which somehow dries up the sources of life? Do you get this paradox? Our understanding of unity, if we understand unity as something which is administrative, centralized, coordinated from some source of power, would automatically lead to a collective organization which would be very fine materially, but which would end up somewhere depriving us of a certain freedom and a certain ability to grow organically. And this is a question that Sri Aurobindo starts the text with. And it's something that will keep haunting you as you read the text, because you'll scratch yourself thinking, does Sri Aurobindo want human unity or not? Well, obviously he does. And it's evident that it's one of the fundamental movements of nature. But how do we reconcile this? So one important distinction that he makes is that we cannot confuse unity with uniformity. So here we have an important idea, and again I want to throw this question out. How do you see this difference between unity and uniformity? If anyone wants to take a chance at answering that. So, if somebody can relay that. self-determination. Okay, that's a very interesting point. So you are involved in the process. Yes.
Experiment,
Yes. Yes.
which is very extended period of imposed communism.
Yes. Okay. So yes. Sorry. Yes. Unanimity and consensus. Right. Right. See what is. Yes, please.
I'm wondering if uniformity has a uniformity by the name, but unity can encourage diversity. Like I'm British and there's the United
Yes.
Kingdom and they're
Yes.
quite different countries. So it can allow for some diversity. That's one aspect perhaps of the difference.
Absolutely. I mean, that really takes us to the heart of the difference. Does anyone else have something to say? Yes. Uniformity is more external, whereas unity is more. Okay. Yes, Anandi? He said it. All right.
I have a very
Yes.
simple example of a family growing
Right.
up. Every child is different, but there is a family unity. But there is no uniformity because each one is a unique person.
Yes, hopefully. Yeah. Yes. So,
In all the civilization, art, when it has become uniform, it was a sign that the civilization was dying.
was dying out. Right. Right.
All the civilization have been leading to one form of
Yes.
art,
Yes.
and nobody was able to go out
Yes.
of it, and it was a sign that the civilization was
Yes.
dead.
Yes. Okay. Yes, Lalit bhai, please.
I think for me, uniformity conforms more to matter,
Okay.
and unity is more in the essence.
Okay. Interesting. Interesting. Okay. So lots of interesting ideas here. Sorry, Jaya. Yes.
And just a thought for unity, that it includes also, in my opinion, the acceptance of differences.
Acceptance of
Yeah,
differences.
That means
Right.
Whatever the group is, a family, what was said, or a community, or a nation, that differences are honored.
Yes. Yes. So this is one of the key distinctions, please. Yes.
Just one thought that unity for me is given if only we can perceive it. It's everywhere, while uniformity seems to be the result of the poverty of the limitations of our minds.
True. True. See, I think everyone seems to be like leaning towards unity, and they're not very happy with uniformity, which is we are on the right track. That's understandable. But before we pursue that line a little further, we have to recognize why uniformity is attractive. Because though we may not want it, it is a fact that successive experiments, political experiments in history, have tried to impose it. Why is uniformity attractive? So this comes down to something which was mentioned by a few different people, also Lalit bhai. It comes down to the makeup of who we are as human beings. So once again, even while exploring social and political philosophy, we must take recourse to understanding human consciousness. So one of the problems of human nature precisely is that the way we are constituted. So take for example, I'll take something which Lalit bhai just said, that in matter there is uniformity. In fact, you will notice that in nature, as you proceed upward in an evolutionary sense, right, there is more and more individuality which manifests. So it is not surprising that all of us individually, we don't like uniformity, because we have reached a stage, our minds have developed to a point where we cherish our individuality. And so we certainly don't like to be told that we should be the same as others. And so but the problem is that when you are governing in a group, this same individuality causes a problem, because it means dealing with too much complexity. And the simple solution, at least to the mind, in order to deal with that complexity of individuality, is to propose that we should all be as similar as possible, so that the boat doesn't go in too many different directions. So when there is a stress on uniformity, it is easier administratively, so to say, to deal with it. So this is again another paradox that we are confronted with, that when we talk about large aggregates, we are compelled to create some kind of structure or order in order to bring in control, and yet we as individuals would not like to be under that control, though we may enjoy the peace and the stability and the prosperity it might bring, right? These examples, somebody mentioned the Soviet Union, but we don't even have to look back into history for this. Even today in the world, it plays out in so many different ways. This constant struggle between unity, uniformity, diversity. So one thing that all political philosophy has to deal with are a few terms, right? And I'll just throw this out here. You have the individual, you have the group or the community, and you have humanity as a whole. These three terms are consistent across all systems of political thought. The difference between various political philosophies is the importance that you give to one or the other over the others. So those systems which prioritize the individual or which prioritize the group arrive at different formulations, right? We don't have the time to go into this further, but I just want to leave this idea with you. And the state, the government, whether it is the government of a nation or whether it is the administration of a company or the head of an organization, the state is mediating between the three terms. Usually between just the two terms, humanity doesn't come in. So the state mediates between the individual and the group. So our consistent challenge as we try and arrive at perfect groupings, and this is true for all kind of communities, including where we are today in Auroville or in the ashram or anywhere else in the world, our consistent challenge is the state having to mediate between the individual and the group, right? The demands of the individual and the demands of the group. This is a constant challenge, and this conflict plays itself out in so many different ways. So is there a solution? How do we address this challenge? So in the ideal of human unity, Sri Aurobindo looks at many possible via systems which could be explored, and he considers their disadvantages and their advantages. We are not going to go into all of that today, but I will just take you to one passage where these issues are discussed in a very beautiful way, and we can meditate upon it as we read it. So I will, Kshitij, that's the page number 569. I will zoom in a bit. I'll take it from here. Freedom, equality, brotherhood. You will recognize this, of course, as the three principles upon which the French Revolution was founded upon. And Sri Aurobindo frequently in his social and political works refers to the French Revolution and to these three terms as being divinely inspired, as being representative of something fundamental to the growth of human consciousness. Freedom, equality, brotherhood are three godheads of the soul. They cannot be really achieved through the external machinery of society or by man so long as he lives only in the individual and the communal ego. When the ego claims liberty, it arrives at competitive individualism. When it asserts equality, it arrives first at strife, then at an attempt to ignore the variations of nature, and as the sole way of doing that successfully, it constructs an artificial and machine-made society. A society that pursues liberty as its ideal is unable to achieve equality. A society that aims at equality will be obliged to sacrifice liberty. For the ego to speak of fraternity is for it to speak of something contrary to its nature. All that it knows is association for the pursuit of common egoistic ends, and the utmost that it can arrive at is a closer organization for the equal distribution of labor, production, consumption, and enjoyment. Yet is brotherhood the real key to the triple gospel of the idea of humanity. The union of liberty and equality can only be achieved by the power of human brotherhood, and it cannot be founded on anything else. But brotherhood exists only in the soul, and by the soul. It can exist by nothing else. For this brotherhood is not a matter either of physical kinship or of vital association or of intellectual agreement. When the soul claims freedom, it is the freedom of its self-development, the self-development of the divine in man in all his being. When it claims equality, what it is claiming is that freedom equally for all and the recognition of the same soul, the same Godhead in all human beings. When it strives for brotherhood, it is founding that equal freedom of self-development on a common aim, a common life, a unity of mind and feeling founded upon the recognition of this inner spiritual unity. These three things are in fact the nature of the soul. For freedom, equality, unity are the eternal attributes of the spirit. It is the practical recognition of this truth. It is the awakening of the soul in man and the attempt to get him to live from his soul and not from his ego, which is the inner meaning of religion. And it is that to which the religion of humanity also must arrive before it can fulfill itself in the life of the race. So, two things that I would like to point out. One is this term that he uses, religion of humanity. He explains this, and he is careful to say that it should not be confused with religion in the typical sense of a religion with creed and dogma and sectarian ideology. He uses the term religion of humanity to kind of refer to a certain perspective or way of thinking about human unity. The other thing is to recognize how Sri Aurobindo does something here which is really revolutionary and radical in the spiritual history of India, because he has taken what is fundamentally a Vedantic ideal or perspective and linked it to social and political philosophy. And that is what I was referring to earlier in my talk, that in this sense he has done something which is pioneering, because traditional Indian spirituality has usually not been concerned with the collective growth of humanity or of collectivities. So here we find something which is really fascinating, where a profound and fundamental Vedantic experience is translated in terms of social and political philosophy. So this is I will stop here as far as the ideal of human unity is concerned and move on to the next book. And just to give you a taste of the text and what you can see more, you can read more later on and explore for yourself. Let's go to the next book, which is The Human Cycle. So The Human Cycle is a very different kind of text. You cannot guess from its title what it's trying to do, unlike the other one that we just saw. There is, of course, an attempt to interpret and understand human history and to make sense of where it is leading. There was a German writer, political thinker called Lamprecht, who in the early 20th century wrote a book on his social and political philosophy, and he uses 5 terms to describe the progression of humanity. Sri Aurobindo actually borrows these 5 terms from Lamprecht. These 5 terms Sri Aurobindo calls them ages of humanity, through which humanity has passed. Begins with the symbolic age, moves to the typal age, proceeds to the conventional age, which is then followed by the individualistic or the rational age, and finally leads to the subjective or spiritual age. So Sri Aurobindo uses these 5 terms, but he says, I wish to give them a completely different meaning than what Lamprecht read into them, but he says that he obviously got something intuitive which can be explored further. So very briefly we'll cover the first 4 terms because we are interested in the subjective or the spiritual age predominantly. But what are the first 4? So the symbolic age refers to a period in human history which is fairly universal, interestingly, which is not unique to India, though we can talk about it a lot more in India because we still have a memory of that symbolic age through the Vedic and the Upanishadic texts. But Sri Aurobindo says this was a period which was universal in the world in many different places, but it has not been preserved in the way that it has been in India. The memory of it has not been preserved. So what is the symbolic age? In very brief, it is when symbols are used to express profound truth to a humanity which is not yet rationally or mentally developed to interpret these symbols rationally. So it uses the symbol as a means of expressing profound and intuitive knowledge. Typically in the symbolic age, Sri Aurobindo says, you have a few who understood the symbols, the initiates, the rishis as they were known in India, and you had the many who interpreted the symbols in terms of rituals. And so rituals were not seen as something negative or were not seen as something inferior, but as a physical embodiment of those symbols. The symbolic age proceeds to the typal age. The typal age, as the name suggests, is when society develops certain guidelines, types, structures. These structures give a certain order and organization to society. Again, this is something that you will find reflected across the world in many different contexts. In India, these structures created what we understand today in terms of Indian culture or the various aspects of Hinduism, though the term Hinduism was not used then. These structures organized society and gave it a certain orientation or direction inspired by the symbolic age. This leads to a conventional age when these same structures become so rigid and inflexible that it causes society to harden and become incapable of growth and progress. When that happens, it leads to a movement against conventions, which was led by Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, which had parallels in other civilizations, but Europe predominantly uses the mental consciousness to question these conventions, and that leads us to an age of individualism or the rational age. And then moving quickly forward, around the 18th and 19th century, Sri Aurobindo says we see the beginnings of what he calls the subjective age or the spiritual age. Now, this is of course something that needs a lot more elaboration, but I thought what I would do today is to focus mostly on the subjective age and how it is relevant to us today. So, when we talk about subjectivism, the key idea in subjectivism is questions of identity. The questions that are central to subjectivism are questions of identity. Who we are as a people, as a nation, as a collectivity. So Sri Aurobindo says that the seeking for the self, now this again you will connect to, of course, ancient Indian thought and ancient Indian spiritual practices. When the seeking for the self extends itself to groups of people is when we have the indications of subjectivism. And he presents many examples of the beginnings of subjectivism, not just in India or the freedom movement in India, but also in Europe, also in how nations in Europe were beginning to seek for their own identities. Now, within subjectivism, Sri Aurobindo makes certain stages, and this is very interesting. He says we cannot expect to jump into a full subjectivism immediately. It will proceed through certain stages, and these stages are full of inherent dangers. Why? Because any seeking for identity is full of dangers. The moment there is a seeking to know who we are, it is easy to mistake something else for the self. There are countless parables in the Upanishads which talk about this, which talk about how individuals wanting to discover themselves mistake something else for the self. And Sri Aurobindo warns us that a similar problem can manifest in the collective sphere. So, question now for the audience. Can you give me an example of historical examples in the past where this kind of seeking for collective identity has led to movements or political movements or examples in history which can lead to some very dangerous and you know, apparently false conclusions? Yes. So, okay. Thank you. Yeah, I just heard Germany. Yes.
No, I mean
Yes.
that Sri Aurobindo himself,
Yes.
about the false subjectivism,
Yes.
mentioned Nazi Germany.
Yes.
But one thing that you are not introducing is the infraracial age.
Yes. Too little time.
Because
So
I'm
we are-
particularly interested
Yes.
in that. Anyhow,
We are
thanks.
jumping straight into the spiritual age. Yeah. Yes, Germany, but interestingly, Sri Aurobindo does not actually write about Nazi Germany because he wrote that chapter in 1918. I'm sorry, in 1918, actually 1917, on false subjectivism. And what is interesting is he actually he sees it coming before it actually comes. He sees already that there are movements that are taking place in Europe which seem to move towards a seeking for identity which can lead to something very dangerous. And he cautions this. He says it's not unique to Europe, it can happen anywhere. It is not something that has happened and cannot happen again. So now what I'll do is I'm going to jump to a passage where Sri Aurobindo talks about the stages through which we can expect the advent of what he calls the spiritual age. So I'm going to go to 247. Actually 250, yeah. I'm going to zoom in a bit. Yeah. This is his warning. He says, a subjective age may stop very far short of spirituality. For the subjective turn is only a first condition, not the thing itself, not the end of the matter. The search for the reality, the true self of man may very easily follow out the natural order described by the Upanishad in the profound apologue of the seekings of Brighu, son of Varuna. I'll skip this part and come to what he says here. After the material formula which governed the greater part of the 19th century had burdened man with the heaviest servitude to the machinery of the outer material life that he has ever yet been called upon to bear, the first attempt to break through, to get to the living reality in things and away from the mechanical idea of life and living and society, landed us in that surface vitalism which had already begun to govern thought before the two formulas, inextricably locked together, lit up and flung themselves on the lurid pyre of the world war. So two things to note here. What he refers to as the material formula is largely the mechanistic principles that became central to human development in the 17th and 18th century. And these mechanistic principles were seen as the most important progress that humanity has made up to that point. And certainly in the material respect, it was a phenomenal progress that took place. But then you see the next step, he talks about this vitalism, a subjective vitalism. Now, it is not that the vitalism in itself is something that he sees as wrong. I mean, after all, the preeminent philosopher of this form of vitalism, we could say, was Nietzsche in Germany, where he speaks about the power of the vital force applied to individuals, but also to collective groups. But the danger in that is when, as we discussed in the case of Nazi Germany, when that becomes identified as domination and superiority over others and wanting to control larger and other groups. And then he says something, so this vital period, we could say, begins in the early 20th, late 19th century and comes into the mid 20th century. And then the next step, which is very interesting, he says, but beyond the subjectivism of the vital self, page 251, there is the possibility of a mental subjectivism, which would at first, perhaps emerging out of the predominant vitalism and leaning upon the already realized idea of the soul as a soul of life and action, but correcting it, appear as a highly mentalized pragmatism. There is a scholar in Singapore, Jared Quek, who was at the University of Oxford, and he's one of the few people who's actually done some work on the human cycle and written about it in the context of social and political philosophy. And there is something very interesting that he points out. He talks about this mental subjectivism, and he says that the markers of mental subjectivism are evident for us to see today. So how do we explain this? So from the 1950s onwards, with the advent of computing, with the advent of the internet, with the advent of artificial intelligence, there is more and more a worldview. If you were to talk to people people who believe in the development of the world as it is today, without necessarily referring to anything spiritual, they would tell you that the future belongs to more and more connected intelligence, artificial intelligence. There are scholars who have written a number of papers at MIT, for example, who have asked themselves the question, are we living in a mental simulation, in a computer simulation? Is existence a computer simulation? You have Kevin Kelly, who was the editor of the Wired magazine, who wrote an interesting book called Out of Control, where he says the future of humanity is basically we will be embedded with chips that will connect with each other, and we will have a hive mind. Now, all these different theories essentially seem to place the mind at the top of whatever is possible. It places the mind, the mental consciousness, in the center of things. And so this is kind of a mental subjectivism that we will see more of, actually. And it need not be something that sometimes it's scary for us, but it need not be, because it can lead to, if we take just a step behind, we may be able to transcend the barrier between the apparent physical mental consciousness, outer mental consciousness, and the subliminal planes that are behind. So I want to end today by referring to what are some of, there are two chapters in the human cycle which are really remarkable if you are interested in thinking or understanding the spiritual age. And those are the last two chapters of the book. And some of the hallmarks of the spiritual age, he says, one is that we should not confuse spirituality with asceticism. So very classic Sri Aurobindo, he's telling us right up front that the spiritual age is not an age where we give up on the world and withdraw. Second, he talks about the importance of the individual. We have spent almost an hour talking about social and political philosophy, but Sri Aurobindo reminds us that ultimately it is the individual who is the agent of change. And it is the individual who pushes forth to bring forth something new. The collectivity is important in the measure that it is able to assimilate and hold that progress of the individual or of the individuals. It is in this context that communities like Auroville, Ashram, or even others who may or may not be affiliated with Sri Aurobindo or the Mother, but wherever there is an intention for conscious living to take place, that is the value of such communities. Because what they do is they provide a basis for this growth of the individual to manifest in a collective sphere. And notwithstanding the many challenges that we are all aware form part of such experiments, in the vision of Sri Aurobindo, and the mother of course speaks about this further, such experiments are vital for something new to manifest, for something, for humanity to take a step forward into living with, living under an ideal that is not merely mental or vital or material, but which has a certain spiritual core at its basis. So with this, I invite you to go further and read these texts and make your own discovery of them. And if you have questions, of course, we can take them up now.
You said about artificial intelligence.
Yes.
Then man will not become robotic because it is artificial. There is nothing natural. So what is your?
Yeah. So one thing which is fairly certain is that we will see these movements growing. There is no way that it's going to stop. But what is interesting is that sooner or later, we will also more and more recognize that how much ever benefit or progress we can make through these means, fundamental questions of consciousness are not going to be solved. So that will keep hitting us in the face. That and we see this with the internet, for example. When the internet came up, we were a generation that saw the transition. We grew up without any internet, and then when we were in our teens, we saw it coming. And I remember the optimism that people had about the internet, and I'm still very optimistic about what it represents. But everyone felt, oh, the world is going to come together, there will be more collaboration, there will be more harmony, people will understand each other more. And certainly those are some of the things that have happened, but nobody anticipated the kind of antagonisms that it will lead to, the kind of things that you see on social media, the vitriol, the hatred, which you would not have been exposed to earlier. So all these tools will merely put in front of you the inevitability of the change of consciousness. And that process will only hasten, whether you have artificial intelligence or you have other technologies. Yes.
My question is to what extent the artificial intelligence would address the issue of understanding the soul of the human being.
Yeah, I mean, that's precisely the challenge, I think.
So that's the next challenge.
Yes. But one thing, yes, sorry.
If that happens, I'm sorry, I don't want anybody to manipulate my soul. And I would like to maintain that freedom for myself to grow as.
Yeah. No, I'm no advocate of technology and artificial intelligence. I'm just saying that these trends that we see today are indicative of this mental subjectivism that we seem to be living through. The point to note is that Sri Aurobindo says something interesting. He says, when we can grow into true subjectivism, every domain of our existence will be affected. So even science will change in the way that we understand it. He says, in the field of beauty and aesthetics, we will create such wonderful things that it will overshadow whatever has been created by humanity till now. In the field of ethics, in the field of political systems, the principle is very simple. If we move from a limited mental consciousness, if we accept that there is something beyond that, behind, which is inherently superior, then that consciousness will create whatever the mind has created, but in an infinitely more potent and powerful way. And so whatever we have as human beings today, if it is governed from that deeper principle, will manifest something more, fantastic.
To allow artificial intelligence to play with the human beings' consciousness?
There is always danger in everything. In all forward movement, there is danger.
So man is a transitional being, and there are several stages within the subjective and spiritual stage,
Yes.
the cycle. So do you see something, a smooth transitioning happening, underlining all the outer movements? And where are we now? Where are we heading in the future? Also, in terms of the fact that we are celebrating Sri Aurobindo's 150th anniversary, the kind of concentrated input from his consciousness and from people aspiring for that, what role will it have in kind of making that transition more smooth?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had the answers to your questions. What I can, I mean, all I can say is that what I take away from my reading of these texts is that it is easy to become pessimistic when you see the play of world forces and events in a superficial way. It's I mean, there's no denying that you feel sad and affected by what happens in so many different contexts. At the same time, I think it's important to keep a perspective which allows you to remain a little universal or cosmic, if I may say so, to remember that history spans over centuries and thousands of years. And what we are seeing, this rapid acceleration that is happening over the last 100, 200 years, we are in the middle of this acceleration. And so sometimes cataclysmic world events can lead to surprising results. Take, for example, the formation of the European Union. Arguably, there is no way something of that nature could have formed had it not been for two catastrophic world wars. So, in the same way, sometimes nature uses means and methods which can seem very cruel or very very harmful in a specific context, but the larger movement can still progress. So that's the best that I can offer in terms of being optimistic. But any other questions? Yes, please. Sorry. Sorry, you have the mic. Yes.
Julie done?
I just finished since I had the mic. I would like to take the example of taking on to the content of the essays in the ideal of human unity and the human cycle. For me, there are two, the North Pole and South Pole of our very research, if we consider Auroville as a lab, if we are experimenting human unity. So, the 50 years gone by, how would you analyze whether we are in that process in becoming?
I'm not going there. No, but jokes apart, this is for all of us to think for ourselves. And I think at the end of the day, we can look at ourselves in the mirror and ask, how far have we come? Instead of thinking always in terms of how far has the collective gone, how far have we come? And in the measure that we are able to make that progress, the collectivity reflects it. So to always externalize progress and to think, oh, but you know, this should have been so much better, or this can be so much better. Personally, I feel it is much more effective to turn that mirror and say, what can I do? How much better can I make in that, you know, progress can I make? Because that reflects directly on the collectivity. So that is a much more, I think, practical approach. Yeah. So yes.
I'm curious about if there is any evolution in Sri Aurobindo's writings or in his thoughts about nation. Because you said that nation mediates between individual and community.
The state, yes.
The state, yeah.
Yes.
So, but now we know historically the state is not a neutral mediator. It has its own vested interest.
Yes.
And it's very disastrous.
Yes.
So, and this critique is also historically available in his time. For
Yes.
example, Gandhi is very critical of nation state.
Yes.
Tagore is very critical.
Yes.
Henry David Thoreau is very critical.
Yes.
So
That's
I'm
a,
curious
yeah, it's a
about
very
that.
interesting question actually.
And one more question.
Yes.
If I'm just starting to read him, so if this evolution he is speaking about, is it just a evolution of consciousness, or is it a biological evolution also?
Yes.
If it is, he also talks about a biological evolution. For me, it feels like, I'm asking so that you can correct me, a bit dogmatic in the sense that some religions says to us, like you are a born sinner, or indirectly you are not good enough now.
Okay.
You have to go through some linear process to
Right.
be good enough.
So let me take the first question in the order. So Sri Aurobindo's writings on the nation state are very interesting because there is a distinct evolution. When you read his writings in the Bande Mataram during his nationalist period, he is making a very strong case for the nation state for obvious reasons, because he is fighting the British, and it's the time when he is establishing the idea of India as an independent and free nation. When you take the ideal of human unity, there are two very interesting chapters where he talks about how the nation state develops, not just in the Indian context, but also in a general global context. And he says that the stages that the nation state goes through in order to develop imply a certain constriction at a certain stage. That constriction can come either from a ruler from within or a foreign rule from outside, but something which compels the different aspects of diversity that are there to somehow coalesce and form a collective sense, and that leads to the formation of a national identity. So there is a kind of almost a tapasya that a group has to go through before it can coalesce as a nation state. When you read his Independence Day message of 1947, he says that it is hoped, I'm paraphrasing, but it is more or less correct, I believe. He says it is hoped that the idea of nationalism will lose its militancy. As I said, it's not an exact quote, but he uses this idea, by which it is obvious that the idea of nationalism as a superiority of one over the other is something that he would not have subscribed to, for sure. Even when he speaks about India and the rise of India, it is not in the sense of a domineering nation state. At the same time, it would be wrong to say that the nation form is no longer relevant or important, and we can move towards internationalism without regard for the nation structure. And why it is wrong is because the nation state preserves a certain fundamental cultural integrity, a certain linguistic, cultural, spiritual, religious identity, which if we lose out, the world becomes the poorer for it. So even when he talks of the ideal of human unity, in the ideal that he speaks about, which I didn't have time to go into, he says each nation must preserve its fundamental characteristics and its soul qualities, and together there must be even when there is a unity which is established at a deeper level, the diversity is fundamental to human life. So in short, I would say the nation does not lose all validity in Sri Aurobindo's thought. At the same time, he does not believe in the narrow nationalism of any kind. Yeah. The second question is a very long, and it's little, I mean, we can go into it, but it's not central to what we are discussing. Maybe later we can talk about it. The notion of evolution, biological and spiritual, we can discuss it perhaps later on. Yes.
My knowledge, there are 2.1 billion who are connected to Facebook in the developed countries. In China, there is one specific system. Facebook is
Yes.
forbidden.
Yes.
There are more than 3 billion people who are connected to social media, and it's a total addiction
Yes.
who is directed by algorithms
Yes.
who are written
Yes.
not by artificial intelligence. These algorithms are written by men and
Yes.
women.
Yes.
And they
Yes.
are written in one direction.
Yes.
And they are very effective because they are answering to a profound need of the human, of community. And they are creating so much addiction that a lot of people have to be treated
Yes.
for that.
Yes.
How you are, how the consciousness can be on the way when you are seeing that
Yes.
50% of the population
Yes.
is totally addicted to a few people who are telling them how to think.
Yes. No, so absolutely. I mean, I would just add, the need is not just community but also narcissism. So that is also what drives most of these things. No, the thing is that the point I was trying to make also, that we are creating systems, more and more complex systems, which allow us to connect in various ways. And we have algorithms, as you said, written by humans. They are not going to resolve any problem of consciousness. They will only bring forth in a more acute manner what needs to be resolved. So what you will see actually is an acceleration of the kind of problems that would have taken a long time to come up. You're going to see more and more of those problems coming up, and you being forced to confront them. Ultimately, we cannot rely on any algorithm or any technological process to make the change happen for us. But the situations are created where we are compelled to ask ourselves, how do we overcome them? So these are ultimately, it's a human problem rather than a technological problem. Which is not to say that technology can't be controlled. It can and it should in some ways. But ultimately, it comes down to us as humans. Maybe one last question and then we'll wrap up. Yes.
Also, a very practical question. Since you've invited us to read both these texts,
Yes.
how much would you say familiarizing with the text or concepts that he refers to and the context in which he's writing, how much does that inform or enrich the reading?
That's a very nice question. It always feels nice when your former student asks an intelligent question. So in the ideal of human unity, Sri Aurobindo specifically says in the foreword that the reader, he gives the breakup of the years and the months when he wrote the text, and he specifically says that the reader should inform himself or herself of the events that are taking place at the time that he is writing. So for the ideal of human unity, I would say you require, if you want to make the best use of that text, you require a fairly thorough grounding of world history and of contemporary events that were taking place when Sri Aurobindo was writing the book. The human cycle also requires a certain background in history, but in the ideal of human unity, it is quite intense. Every chapter he is giving you example after example. And I find this really fascinating because, as you know, Sri Aurobindo was in Puducherry at the time with very limited access to information and news in the conventional sense. And here he is sitting in Puducherry on Rue François Martin, writing about events that are taking place all over the world and seeing these play of forces. It's just fascinating when you think about it. So to answer your question, it certainly helps if you are able to connect the historical examples that he gives to what he is writing. And since this is a social and political work, there's no ignoring that. So you have to have a certain background. Oh yes, there are. If you look up, there are quite a few people have done work on that. Yes, Madhav Panditji has done. If you Google it, you will see, I forget what it's called now, but there are glossary of words. So with that, one last question. Yes.
As a student, if I want to start reading,
Yes.
would you recommend any particular series of, like, he would have written the texts in different times, but as a student of Sri Aurobindo who have gone through all the texts, would you recommend a particular series, or whether he has recommended a particular series?
I think it's a very individual choice. You'll have to see what, you're asking across his collected works or just these two texts?
In terms of understanding like his texts in a methodical, systematic way.
Yeah, it's a question which a lot of people ask actually, and I don't think there is a single answer. What really helps is to first get a feel, maybe just to know the breadth of all that he has written. So just see the collected works, see the titles, get a feel for all the different topics that he has covered, and then see what appeals to you, what interests you. And usually that can be a powerful door to further your interest and studies. So if you're looking for specific on the practice of yoga, maybe start with the letters on yoga. If your interest is somehow related to Indian culture, then take up his essays on Indian culture. Something along those lines. Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Thank you, Devdip. It was so fascinating and lots of interest we can see. So we will definitely invite him again and to continue in this line of, I would say, our soul's seeking and the questions that we have still, how the evolution, how as individual we can participate in this evolution, and how can we follow best Mother and Sri Aurobindo's books also. So thank you again, and please do come back, and we are going to again soon contact you. Thank you very much. And thank you all of you being here, and wish you all the best. And our next program will be on, coming event is for different films on for art films or films on artists, and also we are going to celebrate Navaratri and Diwali. So just watch out on the news and notes and Oronet, all that we are going to propose for 50th of Bharat Nivas. Thank you very much.